This video was brought to you by Brilliant. As we mentioned in previous videos, the pace of advance in Ukraine has essentially stalled. While Ukrainian forces have staged some successful counteroffensives in the Kharkiv and Kherson oblasts, and Russian forces have made minor advances in Donbass, the overall picture just hasn't changed much. However, in the last couple of weeks, both sides have refocused their attention away from the east and towards the south. And Ukrainian authorities have made it clear that they plan on recapturing Kherson city, a regional capital that the Russians first occupied in early March. In response, the Russians have redeployed forces from Donbass to Kherson, and the stage is now set for a decisive battle for the city. So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at the most recent developments on the battlefield, how Ukrainian forces have so far assailed Russian forces in Kherson, and what a full-scale recapturing might involve. So, before we get into Kherson, a quick look at Donbass, where fighting is still ongoing. Having captured Severodonetsk and Lysychansk in early July, Russian forces in the east have now turned their attention to the two remaining major Ukrainian holdouts in Donbass, Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. Now, these two towns, Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, are in the north of the Donetsk Oblast, with a pre-war population of 160,000 and 100,000 people respectively, and both are about 70 kilometers west of Lysychansk. Now, if Russian forces continue with their current strategy of slow encirclements, followed by heavy artillery barrages, as they did in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, then they'll probably try and come from the south in Izium, the west in Siversk, and the north from Bakhmut. Now, while Russian forces did take Izium in April, their southwards advance has essentially stalled since then, and Russian forces have struggled to make significant progress in either Siversk or Bakhmut, despite the fact that neither town is particularly heavily fortified. And over the last month, Russian forces have moved at most a couple of kilometers, and are yet to make inroads into either town. Now, as we mentioned in previous videos, this is partly due to the impact of Western-supplied HIMARS systems. HIMARS have allowed Ukrainian forces to counter Russian artillery and undermine Russian logistical operations by targeting supply dumps. And Ukraine even claims that they've now destroyed more than 50 Russian ammo depots using HIMARS systems. These strikes have also limited Russia's capacity for costly artillery barrages, which require significant amounts of ammunition. Russian howitzers are expanding 20,000 shells a day on average, compared to just 6,000 fired by Ukraine. And the ratio for rocket artillery and ballistic missile launches is even worse. However, Russia's struggles in Donbass can also be attributed to the fact that Putin has been forced to redeploy some of his forces in Donbass to Kherson and Zaporizhia, in response to Ukraine's escalating counteroffensives in the south. According to the region's military governor, in the last few weeks, Ukrainian forces have recaptured 44 towns and villages along the border areas, representing 15% of the territory taken by Russia in the early days of the war. So, Russia has subsequently shifted some of its troops from Donbass to the south, with Ukrainian intelligence claiming that Russia has withdrawn its airborne tactical groups from the Donetsk Oblast and redeployed those units to occupied Kherson territories 2 weeks ago. And the British Defence Ministry recently reported that Russia was reinforcing its defensive positions across occupied areas in southern Ukraine, in a likely response to anticipated Ukrainian offences. And this was essentially confirmed by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov last month, when he said that the Kremlin was expanding its war aims to include Kherson and Zaporizhia. You get the idea then. Ukrainian counteroffensives in Kherson have forced Russia to redeploy its forces away from the east, hindering their advance in Donbass. However, in the last week or so, things have become even more dire for Russian forces. And that's because Ukrainian forces have now made sufficient advances around the city to allow them to target the bridges over the Dnipro River into Kherson with their HIMARS system. Now, Kherson is the only Russian-held city on the western side of the Dnipro River, which means that Russian forces have a limited number of bridges to move troops into the city or supply the troops who are already there. Now, there are essentially two routes over the river into Kherson: the Antonovsky Bridge and a railway bridge next to it, and the Novokakhovka Dam, which also acts as a bridge for Russian military hardware. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, Ukrainian forces have been shelling both sites, and while Novokakhovka is still operational, the Antonovsky Bridge is now unusable, forcing Russian forces to set up pontoons alongside it. Now, obviously, relying on pontoons severely limits Russia's ability to reinforce and resupply its forces in Kherson. And if Novokakhovka becomes unusable, Russian forces will either have to rely on pontoons entirely or use a river crossing near Zaporizhzhia, some 125 miles away. And that's not going to be easy, because Ukrainian forces will probably also try to assert control over the M14-P47 highway that runs from Kherson to Novokakhovka, which Russians are currently using as a logistical base. If this happens, then Russian forces in Kherson will be left almost completely isolated, and a Ukrainian attempt on Kherson will become a real possibility. Ukrainian officials do seem optimistic about this as well. An aide to the administrative head of the Kherson region claimed on Sunday that the Kherson region would be liberated by September. Now, while September might be a little optimistic, Russians are clearly taking the Ukrainian threat in the south seriously. As we mentioned earlier, Russia has redeployed significant forces from Donbass towards Kherson. And in recent days, some have rumored about plans for a Russian offensive towards Mykolaiv, which acts as a logistical base for Ukrainian forces advancing towards Kherson city. And Mykolaiv has suffered endless artillery barrages in the last few days, with Ukrainian intelligence estimating that Russia has some 22,000 troops ready for an offensive on the city. Russia has also accelerated its plans to Russify the area, with a referendum on Kherson's accession to the Russian Federation now due sometime in early September. The deputy head of Russia's separatist forces in Kherson has formally confirmed plans for a referendum, and Russian authorities in Kherson started accepting applications for a 7-person election commission in late July. Now, this isn't a complete surprise. Russian forces have been trying to Russify the area since early March by introducing Russian passports, banning the Ukrainian hryvnia, and rewriting the education syllabus to include pro-Russian propaganda. Nonetheless, the accelerated timetable might imply that Russian forces wanted to get their referendum out there before the Ukrainians are able to mount a counteroffensive. All in all, the next big event in the war is clearly going to be the battle for Kherson, and this will be decisive for a couple of reasons. Now, obviously, Kherson has a strategic value in its own right, but a victory here would provide a much-needed boost for Ukrainian forces and further damage Russian morale. It would also demonstrate to the West that their support really can make a difference on the battlefield, which might be necessary to maintain waning Western interest, especially if a cold winter in Europe puts pressure on political support for Ukraine. Ultimately, we'll have to watch this conflict to see what happens. But looking at Russia's strategy and the support provided by the West, you might start to believe that decisions made by countries and leaders are at random and without any real purpose. However, if you'd like to be more logical in your decision making, then you should check out my favorite course on Brilliant. Their logical thinking course might start simple, but it builds, teaching you logical reasoning skills until you're solving problems which previously looked impossible. And you'll get used to that empowering feeling of learning, because Brilliant's not just about memorization and lectures. Brilliant teaches you by doing, using active learning techniques to teach you the principles behind otherwise complex subjects, and ensuring that you actually understand what's going on. Using this teaching methodology, you can learn about all kinds of STEM topics. That's algebra, applied probability, calculus, gravitational physics, and even cryptocurrency. In fact, they even have a new course from Kherson, which I have to say, I found very personally exciting and spent a lot of time playing with. Anyway, if you want to learn in a more fun way, then you should sign up to Brilliant. And the link in the description will get you 20% off an annual premium subscription, which is not only a great deal, but also supports the channel. So thank you.